The disguised millionaire watched his nanny through Emily's bedroom window, not knowing his heart was about to break. She had been accused of stealing, and tomorrow he would fire her. But tonight, as his fevered daughter cried for the woman she called Mama in her delirium, Robert Carmichael realized he was about to destroy the only real mother his children had ever known. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're caring for a child that isn't yours, setting a dinner table or waiting for someone to say thank you. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart. The morning fog rolled across San Francisco's Pacific Heights like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of the awakening city. Inside the towering Carmichael mansion, with its marble floors that echoed every footstep and crystal chandeliers that caught the filtered sunlight, Rosa Martinez moved through her morning routine with the quiet precision of someone who had learned to be invisible. At 47, her hands bore the calluses of decades spent caring for other people's children, her dark hair streaked with silver threads that caught the light as she bent over the breakfast table, arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase that cost more than most people earned in a month. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon wafted from the kitchen where Rosa had been working since 5 in the morning, preparing homemade pancakes shaped like butterflies for 6-year-old Emily and 8-year-old Claire. These little touches weren't part of her job description, but Rosa had learned long ago that love lived in the details. The extra minute spent cutting fruit into star shapes, the gentle way she braided Emily's hair each morning, the soft Spanish lullabies she hummed while folding tiny clothes that smelled of expensive detergent and childhood dreams. Robert Carmichael descended the curved mahogany staircase at precisely 7:15, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble in a rhythm as predictable as his morning routine. At 42, he commanded a tech empire worth over $200 million, with investments spanning from cryptocurrency portfolios to real estate holdings across 3 states. His net worth fluctuated with the stock market, but his wealth remained constant, cold, impressive, and somehow unable to fill the emotional void that had settled over his home like dust on expensive furniture. "Good morning, Mr. Carmichael," Rosa said softly, her voice carrying the faint accent of her childhood in a small town outside Los Angeles. She placed his coffee exactly where he expected it, black with 1 sugar cube, in the bone china cup his late wife had chosen years ago. Her movements were graceful, despite her sturdy build, efficient, despite the arthritis that sometimes made her fingers ache during San Francisco's foggy mornings. Robert nodded curtly, already checking his phone for overnight market reports and cryptocurrency fluctuations. His Bitcoin investments alone had gained 30% this quarter, but as he glanced at Rosa's weathered hands pouring orange juice into small glasses decorated with cartoon characters, he felt nothing. Not gratitude, not recognition, just the vague awareness that the household machinery was functioning as expected. "The girls will be down in 15 minutes, Rosa continued, wiping down the granite countertop with movements that spoke of practiced care. "Emily has a spelling test today, and Claire has soccer practice after school. I've packed her cleats and an extra water bottle in her backpack." These details meant everything to Rosa and nothing to Robert. He saw schedules where she saw small lives unfolding, logistics where she saw opportunities to nurture. The gap between them stretched wider than the distance between his penthouse office downtown and her modest Castro District apartment, wider than the difference between his Harvard MBA and her high school diploma, wider than the chasm between someone who owned everything and someone who gave everything away. 3 years earlier, Rosa had arrived at the Carmichael mansion carrying a single suitcase and a heart still healing from the deepest wound a woman can bear. Her own daughter, Isabella, had been taken by leukemia at age 5, leaving Rosa with empty arms and a love that had nowhere to go. The grief counselor had suggested she might find healing in caring for other children, and through an agency that specialized in placing nannies with wealthy families, Rosa had found her way to Pacific Heights. The first time she saw Emily and Claire, their blonde hair catching the afternoon light as they played in the mansion's sprawling garden, Rosa felt something shift inside her chest. Emily, then 3, had looked up with eyes the color of summer sky and said, "Are you going to live here?" with the direct curiosity of childhood. Claire, 5 and already showing signs of her father's serious nature, had hung back, observing this new person who smelled like vanilla and spoke with gentle authority. "I'm here to take care of you," Rosa had whispered, kneeling to their eye level on the Persian rug that cost more than she had ever owned. And in that moment, though she didn't know it yet, she was making a promise that would reshape all their lives. Those early months had been a delicate dance of learning boundaries that felt more like walls. Robert made it clear from the beginning. Rosa was an employee, not family. She was to maintain professional distance, follow schedules precisely, and remember her place in the household hierarchy. The children's grandmother, a formidable woman who visited monthly from her Napa Valley estate, reinforced these rules with sharp glances and pointed comments about the help getting too familiar. But children don't understand hierarchies. They know only who makes them feel safe when thunder shakes the windows, who kisses scraped knees better, who remembers their favorite bedtime stories and tells them in voices that chase away nightmares. Emily began calling Rosa Rosita, a nickname that made the nanny's heart flutter like a bird finding its way home. Claire, more reserved but equally attached, would seek Rosa out during moments of childhood crisis, a broken toy, a nightmare, the complex emotions that come with growing up in a house full of beautiful things but short on warmth. Rosa's love for the girls grew like a garden in secret soil. She celebrated their small victories with the fierce pride of motherhood, worried over their fears with sleepless intensity, and stored away their childhood memories like precious photographs. When Emily lost her first tooth, Rosa was the one who knew exactly what the tooth fairy should bring. When Claire scored her first soccer goal, Rosa was watching from the sidelines, cheering with tears streaming down her cheeks. The mansion itself seemed to expand and contract around Rosa's presence. In rooms where she had just been, the air held traces of her warmth, the scent of the hand lotion she rubbed into her dry skin, the echo of her humming, the sense that someone who truly cared had just passed through. But in the formal spaces where family business was conducted, where Robert met with financial advisors and investment managers, where decisions were made about portfolios and properties and charitable foundations, Rosa simply didn't exist. The irony was cruel and complete. Robert could track his assets to the penny, knew the exact value of his stock options and the quarterly returns on his mutual funds, could discuss market volatility and hedge fund strategies with the fluency of someone who lived and breathed wealth. But he couldn't see the woman who was raising his children with a devotion that no amount of money could buy, whose presence had transformed his cold mansion into something resembling a home. Rosa understood her position with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of working for people who had more money than they knew what to do with. She had cleaned houses in Beverly Hills where the weekly grocery budget exceeded her monthly salary, had cared for children whose birthday parties cost more than her annual rent, had watched families struggle with problems that all their wealth couldn't solve. She knew that money could buy many things: private schools and organic food and designer clothes and vacations to exotic places, but it couldn't buy the patient love that helped a child learn to tie their shoes, the steady presence that made bedtime feel safe, the intuitive understanding of when a hug was worth more than any expensive toy. So, Rosa loved in silence, the way she had learned to love, completely, without expecting recognition, without demanding reciprocation. She poured herself into Emily and Claire the way she had once poured herself into Isabella, with the desperate tenderness of someone who understood how quickly love could be taken away. In the pre-dawn hours when the mansion slept, Rosa would sometimes stand in the nursery doorway and watch the girls breathing in their beds, their faces peaceful in sleep, and whisper prayers of gratitude for the chance to love them, even from the margins of their lives. The morning routine continued its predictable patterns. Emily bounded down the stairs in her school uniform, her hair still messy from sleep, while Claire followed more sedately, already dressed and ready for the day. They gravitated toward Rosa like flowers turning toward sunlight, Emily climbing into her lap for a quick cuddle, while Claire accepted the carefully braided hairstyle that Rosa knew she preferred. "Did you remember my library book, Rosita?" Emily asked, her small arms wrapped around Rosa's neck. "Of course, mi amor," Rosa replied softly, using the endearment that slipped out despite her attempts to maintain professional boundaries. "It's in your backpack with your lunch." Robert watched this interaction from behind his newspaper, noting the easy affection between his daughters and their nanny without really seeing it. To him, it was simply part of the household function. The children were fed, dressed, and prepared for school. The machinery of daily life operated smoothly, allowing him to focus on more important things like the merger deal closing next week or the cryptocurrency investments his financial advisor had recommended. What he didn't see was the way Emily's anxiety about the spelling test melted away in Rosa's reassuring presence, or how Claire's shoulders relaxed when Rosa smoothed her hair and whispered that she would be thinking of her during soccer practice. He didn't notice the way Rosa's eyes followed the girls to the school bus, watching until they disappeared around the corner, or how she stood at the window for an extra moment, sending silent blessings after them into their day. As the house settled into its daytime quiet, Rosa began the tasks that filled her hours until the children returned. She made the beds with hospital corners, her movements efficient despite the way her back ached from years of bending over cribs and little beds. She organized toys with the patience of someone who understood that children's possessions were sacred things, each stuffed animal and puzzle piece part of a world that made sense only to young hearts. She prepared dinner with the same attention to detail she brought to everything else, consulting the girls' preferences over their father's instructions, knowing that Claire wouldn't eat anything green, and Emily went through phases where she would only accept foods that were perfectly round. The loneliness of those daytime hours stretched like shadows across the marble floors. Rosa had learned to fill the silence with small rituals, humming lullabies from her own childhood, talking to the houseplants she tended with religious care, organizing and reorganizing the girls' belongings with the devotion of a keeper of treasures. Sometimes she would find herself in Emily's room, straightening books that didn't need straightening, or in Claire's room, smoothing a bedspread that was already perfect, just to feel closer to the children who had become the center of her world. The evening brought Robert home from his downtown office, his mind full of profit margins and investment strategies, his phone buzzing with messages from business partners and financial advisors. Dinner was served at 6:30 sharp, Rosa moving between kitchen and dining room with the invisible grace of someone who had perfected the art of being present without being seen. She knew Robert's preferences: medium rare steak, vegetables steamed exactly 4 minutes, wine from the collection he kept in the temperature-controlled cellar that cost more than most people's cars. But Rosa's real attention was on the girls, noting Emily's excitement about a new friend in her class, celebrating Claire's description of a perfect soccer kick, storing away these details in the mental scrapbook she kept of their growing lives. These moments around the dinner table were precious to Rosa, a chance to feel almost like family, even though she ate her own dinner later, alone in the kitchen, after cleaning up and preparing for the next day. As bedtime approached, Rosa transformed into the gentle conductor of the evening ritual. Baths were drawn with lavender bubbles, pajamas were chosen from the careful arrangements she made in their drawers, teeth were brushed with stories about sugar bugs and dental superheroes. The real magic happened in the quiet moments before sleep, when Rosa sat on the edge of each bed and listened to the day's adventures, worries, and dreams. Emily, at 6, still believed in fairy tales and magic, and Rosa nurtured this wonder with stories that combined traditional folk tales with gentle lessons about kindness and courage. Claire, more practical at 8, preferred stories about brave girls who solved problems and overcame challenges, and Rosa had developed a repertoire of tales that fed her growing independence while still acknowledging her need for comfort and security. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" Emily would ask every night, and Rosa always said yes, even when her own feet ached and her back protested and she longed for her own bed. She would sit in the comfortable chair beside Emily's bed, sometimes humming, sometimes just being present, watching over this child's descent into dreams with the fierce protectiveness of a guardian angel. These bedtime hours were when Rosa allowed herself to fully feel the love that filled her days. In the darkened nursery, with San Francisco's city lights twinkling beyond the windows and the sound of foghorns drifting in from the bay, Rosa could almost pretend that this was her home, that these were her children, that the love she gave so freely was recognized and returned in equal measure. But morning always came, bringing with it the return to boundaries and hierarchies, the reminder that no matter how much love she poured into this family, she remained an outsider looking in. The pain of this contradiction lived in Rosa's chest like a small stone, heavy and smooth from years of carrying it in silence. She had learned to swallow her hurt, to smile through the casual cruelties, to find joy in the smallest acknowledgments of her humanity. The truth was that Rosa loved Emily and Claire more than their own father did, understood them better than anyone else in their lives, had shaped their early years with a tenderness that would mark them forever. But in a world that valued net worth over actual worth, that measured success in stock portfolios rather than the patient cultivation of young hearts, Rosa's contributions remained invisible, her love unrecognized, her sacrifice unacknowledged. Yet she continued, day after day, because love doesn't require recognition to be real, doesn't need acknowledgement to be true. Rosa loved because loving was who she was, because these children had entered her heart and made themselves at home there, because in caring for them she had found purpose in a world that had taken so much from her. The stage was set for a drama that would unfold in whispers and accusations, in heartbreak and revelation, in the slow recognition of what happens when love is taken for granted for too long. Rosa continued her quiet devotion, unaware that forces were already in motion that would test everything she believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and the complicated relationship between employers and the hearts that serve them. Winter settled over San Francisco like a familiar blanket, bringing with it the kind of penetrating cold that seeped through even the mansion's expensive windows and heated floors. Rosa found herself working longer hours as the shorter days kept the girls indoors, their energy bouncing off the walls of rooms that suddenly felt too small for their growing personalities. She transformed the mansion's formal living room into an adventure playground, building forts out of designer furniture and imported cushions, teaching the girls card games her own mother had taught her decades ago in that small house outside Los Angeles, where love had been abundant even when everything else was scarce. The holidays approached with the mechanical precision that characterized everything in the Carmichael household. Robert's assistant coordinated with an expensive event planning company to decorate the mansion in a theme of silver and white elegance, every ornament placed with artistic consideration, every garland measured to exact specifications. The result was breathtaking and cold, like a photograph in an interior design magazine, beautiful to look at, but impossible to touch without fear of disturbing the perfect arrangement. Rosa watched this transformation with the quiet sadness of someone who understood the difference between decoration and celebration. She remembered Christmases from her own childhood, chaotic affairs with handmade ornaments and cookies baked in a kitchen too small for the amount of love it held. She remembered Isabella's last Christmas, when her dying daughter had insisted on helping decorate their modest tree, her small hands shaking with illness, but her eyes bright with the joy that comes from creating something together. "Can we make cookies, Rosita?" Emily asked one afternoon, pressing her nose against the kitchen window where frost had painted delicate patterns on the glass. "Real cookies that we mix ourselves?" Rosa glanced toward Robert's home office, where he was conducting a video conference with investors in Tokyo, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone discussing millions of dollars as casually as others talked about the weather. She knew that homemade cookies weren't part of the approved household routine, that the kitchen was supposed to remain spotless and unused except for her carefully planned meal preparations. But something in Emily's hopeful expression broke through Rosa's caution. Yes, mi amor, she whispered, already imagining the flour-dusted counters and sticky fingers and laughter that would fill the sterile kitchen with life. We'll make cookies. Claire joined them eagerly, and for the next 2 hours, the mansion's kitchen became what it had never been before, a place where love was measured in cups and tablespoons, where imperfection was celebrated, where three females of different ages and backgrounds found common ground in the simple act of creating something sweet together. Rosa taught them the recipe her grandmother had brought from Mexico, showed them how to roll the dough with gentle pressure, how to use a fork to create patterns that turned simple cookies into small works of art. "These are the best cookies in the whole world," Emily declared with 6-year-old certainty, chocolate chips smeared across her cheek. "Better than the ones from that expensive bakery Daddy orders," Claire agreed, unconsciously echoing Rosa's own thoughts about the difference between bought and homemade pleasures. Rosa felt a warmth spreading through her chest, the kind of happiness that comes from sharing tradition, from passing down knowledge, from creating memories that will last longer than any expensive gift. She took pictures with her old phone, the camera not quite capturing the golden light that seemed to fill the kitchen, the sound of genuine laughter bouncing off the granite surfaces, the way the girls' faces glowed with the satisfaction of accomplishment. Later, after the kitchen had been restored to its previous spotless state, and the cookies stored in containers decorated with the girls' artwork, Rosa sat in her small bedroom and looked at those photographs. Her room, tucked away on the mansion's 3rd floor, was a study in humble comfort, a single bed with a handmade quilt, a dresser that held her few possessions, a window that looked out over the garden where she sometimes sat on her rare free evenings. The walls held photographs of Isabella, a few from her own childhood, and now these new pictures of Emily and Claire covered in flower and happiness. This was Rosa's secret museum, the place where she kept the evidence of love that existed outside the formal boundaries of her employment. In this small room, she allowed herself to dream impossible dreams, that someday Robert would see her not as an employee, but as the woman who had helped raise his daughters, that the girls would understand the depth of her devotion, that love might triumph over the artificial distances created by money and social position. But dreams, Rosa had learned, were luxury items that people like her couldn't afford to indulge too often. Reality lived downstairs in the mansion's cold formality, in Robert's casual dismissiveness, in the constant reminders that she was temporary, replaceable, forgettable. The first crack in this reality appeared on a Tuesday morning in February when Emily came down with what seemed like a simple cold. Rosa noticed it first, the slight cough, the way Emily moved more slowly than usual, the faint flush in her cheeks that suggested fever. She mentioned it to Robert at breakfast, suggesting they keep Emily home from school. "She seems fine to me," Robert replied without looking up from his financial reports, where cryptocurrency values and stock market futures held more immediate interest than his daughter's health. "Send her to school. I can't have her missing classes for every minor sniffle," Rosa wanted to argue, wanted to point out that she had been caring for children for decades and could recognize the signs of illness better than someone whose primary interaction with his daughters involved signing report cards and writing tuition checks. But she had learned to swallow such objections, to defer to Robert's authority even when her instincts screamed otherwise. Emily went to school that day, but she returned home with the fever Rosa had predicted, her small body shaking with chills, her usual brightness dimmed by the misery that comes with childhood illness. By evening, her temperature had spiked to dangerous levels, and even Robert couldn't ignore the seriousness of the situation. "Should we call the doctor?" he asked Rosa, his usual confidence replaced by the helplessness that strikes parents when their children suffer. "I've already called," Rosa replied quietly. "She's on her way." The next few days blurred together in a haze of medicine schedules and temperature readings, of cool cloths applied to burning foreheads and gentle songs hummed in the dark hours before dawn. Rosa barely left Emily's side, catching fragments of sleep in the chair beside her bed, waking instantly whenever the child stirred or called out in fevered dreams. Robert tried to maintain his normal schedule, but found himself drawn repeatedly to Emily's room, watching from the doorway as Rosa provided the kind of care that money couldn't buy. Patient, intuitive, born from love rather than obligation. He saw how Emily's restlessness calmed when Rosa took her hand, how her breathing steadied when Rosa sang lullabies in Spanish, how she accepted medicine without protest when Rosa explained why it would help her feel better. On the third night, when Emily's fever finally broke and she slept peacefully for the first time in days, Robert found Rosa still sitting vigil, her head drooping with exhaustion, her hands folded in her lap like a prayer. Something shifted in his chest as he watched this scene, a recognition that struggled against years of emotional distance, a glimpse of the love that had been surrounding his daughters all along. "You should get some rest," he whispered, not wanting to wake Emily. Rosa looked up with startled eyes, as if surprised to find him there. "She's better now," she said softly. "The fever has broken." "Thanks to you," Robert replied, and the words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised Rosa. They stood there in Emily's doorway, father and Nanny united in their relief, and for a moment the artificial barriers between them seemed less solid, less important than the shared love for the sleeping child before them. Rosa felt something flutter in her chest, not romantic love, but something almost more valuable. The possibility of recognition, of being seen as more than just hired help. But morning brought a return to normal patterns, and the moment of connection faded like a dream half remembered. Robert returned to his office, his markets, his world of financial concerns that had nothing to do with the patient love required to raise children. Rosa returned to her invisible devotion, caring for Emily's recovery while maintaining the smooth operation of a household that took her contributions for granted. Yet something had changed during those fever-soaked nights. Emily's illness had revealed the depth of Rosa's commitment in a way that years of daily care had not. The child had called for Rosita in her delirium, had clung to her nanny's hand with the desperate trust of someone who knows instinctively where safety lies. Rosa had responded with the fierce protectiveness of a mother, sleeping in a chair for 3 nights, monitoring every breath, celebrating each small sign of recovery as if Emily were her own flesh and blood. Claire had watched this drama unfold with the acute perception of an 8-year-old who understood more than adults realized. She saw how Rosa never left Emily's side, how she sang the same lullabies she sang every night but with extra tenderness, how she cried quietly when she thought no one was looking. Tears of worry and love and the terrible vulnerability that comes from loving someone completely. "Rosita loves us more than Daddy does," Claire whispered to her recovering sister one afternoon when Robert was at the office and Rosa was preparing Emily's lunch in the kitchen. "I know," Emily replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom of childhood. "She's our real mama." Children speak truth with devastating clarity, unencumbered by the social conventions that teach adults to pretend otherwise. To Emily and Claire, Rosa wasn't the nanny. She was the woman who kissed their scrapes, who remembered their fears and preferences, who celebrated their small victories and comforted their disappointments. She was the constant in their lives, the steady presence that made home feel safe. But this truth existed in a bubble. Protected by childhood's innocence from the harsh realities of employment law and social hierarchies, from the fact that love doesn't create legal rights or guarantee security. Rosa was still an employee, still replaceable, still vulnerable to the whims of a man who saw her daily devotion as simply part of the service he had purchased. The vulnerability of Rosa's position became clear during a dinner party Robert hosted for potential investors in his latest venture, a cryptocurrency mining operation that promised returns that seemed almost too good to be true. The mansion filled with men in expensive suits and women wearing jewelry worth more than Rosa's annual salary, their conversations flowing around topics that existed in a world completely separate from the realm of bedtime stories and scraped knees. Rosa moved through the party like a ghost, serving appetizers and refilling wine glasses while trying to remain invisible, her presence acknowledged only when someone needed something. She overheard fragments of conversation, discussions of portfolio diversification and market volatility, casual mentions of millions of dollars as if they were discussing the weather. "Your household runs incredibly smoothly, Robert," observed one of the guests, a woman whose diamond bracelet caught the light from the crystal chandeliers. "Your domestic staff is virtually invisible." "That's the point," Robert replied with the satisfaction of someone discussing a well-oiled machine. "I pay for efficiency and discretion. The children are well cared for, the house runs perfectly, and I never have to think about any of it." Rosa felt something cold settle in her stomach as she listened to this exchange. To these people, she wasn't a person with feelings and dreams and a history of heartbreak and resilience. She was simply part of the household infrastructure, as impersonal as the heating system or the security cameras. The love she poured into Emily and Claire every day, the sleepless nights and patient teaching and fierce protectiveness, all of it was reduced to efficiency and discretion. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the mansion had returned to its usual quiet, Rosa sat in her small bedroom looking at the photographs of Emily and Claire that she kept on her dresser. Their faces smiled back at her from a dozen different moments. Birthday parties where she'd been relegated to the kitchen, school plays where she'd watched from the back row, ordinary afternoons when love had felt as natural as breathing. She thought about Isabella, about the dreams she'd once had of watching her own daughter grow up, of being there for first days of school and graduation ceremonies and wedding days. Those dreams had died with Isabella, but new ones had grown in their place. Impossible dreams about Emily and Claire, about being acknowledged as more than just an employee in their lives, about love being recognized rather than taken for granted. But Rosa was 47 years old and had been working for wealthy families long enough to understand the rules of the game. Love was a luxury that people like her gave freely but received sparingly. Stability came from accepting your place, from not expecting more than the job description provided, from finding satisfaction in the small moments of connection that made the loneliness bearable. As spring arrived and the girls grew taller and more independent, Rosa felt the bittersweet passage of time that all caregivers know. The joy of watching children flourish mixed with the sadness of being gradually needed less. Emily had learned to tie her own shoes, Claire could braid her own hair, and both girls were developing friendships and interests that pulled them into a wider world where Rosa's influence was less central. Still, they remained the light of her days, coming to her with their problems and victories, seeking her approval and comfort in ways that filled Rosa's heart even as they reminded her of everything she had lost and found again in this strange, complicated arrangement. She continued to love them with the fierce devotion of someone who understood that love itself was its own reward, that the ability to care for these children was a gift she had been given in the midst of her own grief. The stage was being set for a betrayal that would shatter this careful balance, that would force everyone to confront the difference between what money could buy and what actually mattered. But for now, in the quiet moments before the storm, Rosa continued her patient devotion, unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down by forces she never saw coming. The seeds of Rosa's downfall were planted not in malice, but in envy. By someone whose heart had grown poisonous with resentment over the quiet love that filled every corner of the Carmichael household. Margaret Chen had worked as the mansion's housekeeper for nearly a decade, arriving 3 days a week to dust furniture that rarely got dirty and polish surfaces that gleamed perpetually. She was efficient, thorough, and increasingly bitter about the warmth that seemed to flow between Rosa and the children she'd been hired to care for. Margaret had her own struggles, a husband who gambled away their savings, a son who had dropped out of college to pursue music dreams that paid no bills, financial pressures that made every dollar precious. She watched Rosa receive what seemed like endless love from Emily and Claire, and felt a resentment that grew like a tumor in her chest. Why should this woman, who was nothing more than a glorified babysitter, receive such devotion when Margaret's own sacrifices went unnoticed and unappreciated? The opportunity for revenge presented itself on a gray March morning when Margaret arrived at the mansion to find Rosa rushing to get Emily ready for school. Claire had come down with a stomach bug during the night, and Rosa's attention was divided between comforting one child and preparing the other for her day. In her haste and worry, Rosa left her purse on the kitchen counter while she ran upstairs to check Claire's temperature one more time. Margaret saw the purse sitting open, Rosa's old wallet visible inside, and in a moment of twisted inspiration, she had her weapon. She took a $100 bill from the grocery money envelope that Robert left on the counter each week, money that Rosa was supposed to use for household supplies and the special foods the girls preferred. Margaret slipped the bill into Rosa's wallet, then made sure to mention to Robert later that she had seen Rosa acting nervous and secretive around money. The trap was set with the calculated precision of someone who understood that wealthy people, despite their fortune, often harbored deep suspicions about the honesty of their employees. Robert, who trusted Rosa with his daughters' lives but had never fully trusted anyone with his money, began to pay closer attention to financial details he had previously ignored. Over the following weeks, Margaret fed Robert's suspicions with carefully crafted observations. She mentioned seeing Rosa use her phone frequently during work hours, suggested that some of the household supplies seemed to disappear faster than expected, made comments about Rosa's expensive new jacket that was actually a gift from the girls for her birthday, purchased with their own allowance money at Claire's insistence. "I'm not saying anything definitive," Margaret would say with false reluctance, "but you might want to watch the household budget more carefully. These people sometimes think they're entitled to more than their salary." These people. The phrase carried all the poison of class prejudice and racial suspicion, painting Rosa not as an individual with integrity and dedication, but as a member of a group that couldn't be trusted around wealth. Robert, despite his liberal political views and charitable donations to organizations fighting inequality, found these suspicions taking root in his mind with disturbing ease. The crisis came to a head on a rainy Thursday in April, when Robert, acting on Margaret's suggestions, decided to conduct a surprise inspection of Rosa's belongings. He waited until she was outside, hanging laundry in the mansion's covered porch area, her figure visible through the windows as she moved with the careful precision that characterized all her work. In Rosa's purse, Robert found the $100 bill that Margaret had planted there weeks earlier. His heart sank as he held the money, feeling the weight of betrayal and disappointment. The woman he had trusted with his most precious possessions, his daughters, had been stealing from him all along. Margaret's hints and observations suddenly seemed like the concerned warnings of a loyal employee rather than the manipulative poison they actually were. Rosa returned from hanging laundry to find Robert waiting for her in the kitchen, his face set in lines of cold anger, the $100 bill lying on the granite countertop like evidence in a court trial. "Can you explain this?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that Rosa had never heard from him before. Rosa looked at the money with genuine confusion, her mind racing to understand why Robert seemed so upset about a $100 bill that had somehow appeared with her belongings. "I don't understand," she said softly, her English growing more accented under stress the way it did when she felt threatened or confused. "This money was missing from the household fund," Robert continued, his words cutting through the kitchen's warm air like ice. "Mrs. Chen found it in your purse." The accusation hit Rosa like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her legs suddenly unsteady. In all her years of working for wealthy families, through all the casual cruelties and thoughtless dismissals, no one had ever questioned her honesty. Her integrity was the foundation everything else was built on. Her pride, her self-respect, her ability to sleep peacefully despite the loneliness and invisibility of her work. "I didn't take any money," Rosa whispered, her hands trembling as she looked from Robert's angry face to the bill on the counter. "I would never steal from you, Mr. Carmichael. Never." But Robert's mind was already made up. Influenced by weeks of Margaret's careful manipulation and his own buried suspicions about whether someone from Rose's background could really be trusted around the wealth that defined his world. He saw guilt in Rose's confusion, deception in her shock, confirmation of his worst fears about letting an outsider get too close to his family. "I think it's best if you pack your things and leave today," he said with the cold finality of someone cutting loose a problematic investment. "I'll pay you through the end of the month, but I want you gone before the girls get home from school." The words fell like hammers, demolishing in seconds a relationship that had been built through 3 years of patient devotion. Rosa felt something breaking inside her chest, not just her heart, but something deeper. The belief that goodness would be recognized, that love would protect her, that the children she had raised with such tenderness might somehow shield her from this kind of cruelty. "The girls," she whispered, thinking not of herself, but of Emily and Claire, of how they would return from school to find her simply gone, erased from their lives without explanation or goodbye. "Please let me say goodbye to them." "I don't think that's appropriate," Robert replied, his voice gaining strength from his conviction that he was protecting his daughters from a woman who had betrayed their trust. "It's better to make a clean break." Rosa stood in the kitchen where she had prepared thousands of meals, where she had taught Emily and Claire to crack eggs and measure flour, where just weeks earlier they had made cookies and laughed until their sides hurt. The room that had been transformed by love into something warm and alive suddenly felt cold and foreign, as if all the happiness she had brought to this place had been nothing more than her imagination. She packed her few belongings with the mechanical movements of someone in shock, her hands shaking as she folded clothes that smelled like the expensive laundry detergent of the mansion, gathering photographs and small keepsakes that represented 3 years of invisible devotion. From her dresser drawer, she took the pictures of Emily and Claire covered in flour from their cookie-making session, studies their laughing faces one more time, then slipped them into her suitcase with the careful reverence of someone handling sacred artifacts. The hardest part was walking past the girls' bedrooms, seeing the beds she had made that morning. The clothes she had laid out for tomorrow, the stuffed animals she had arranged with loving precision. Emily's room still smelled faintly of the lavender spray Rosa used to chase away nightmares. Claire's desk held the math homework they had worked on together the night before, Rosa's patient explanations having finally helped the multiplication tables make sense. In 30 minutes, Rosa had packed up a life that had been built through countless small moments of love and care. She left behind much more than a job. She left behind the closest thing to family she had known since Isabella's death, the children who had called her name in their sleep, the home where her love had been the invisible force that held everything together. Margaret watched from an upstairs window as Rosa walked down the mansion's front steps for the last time, carrying her single suitcase and the weight of an accusation that would follow her for the rest of her life. The housekeeper felt a twisted satisfaction at seeing her plan succeed, at removing the woman whose love had made Margaret's own presence seem less important, less valuable. Robert watched too from his home office window and felt a hollow victory that tasted like ashes in his mouth. He had protected his fortune from a threat that had never existed, had removed a danger that had been nothing more than the projection of his own fears and prejudices. The mansion already felt different, colder, quieter, emptier in ways he couldn't quite identify. What none of them knew, as Rosa walked away carrying her broken heart and wounded dignity, was that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. That love leaves traces that can't be erased by accusations or dismissals. The children would return from school to find their world fundamentally altered, their anchor missing, their sense of safety shattered by an absence they couldn't understand. The empty rooms of the mansion would echo with Rosa's absence, reminding everyone who lived there of the warmth that had been taken for granted until it was gone. And somewhere in the Castro district, in a small apartment filled with photographs of the children she was no longer allowed to love, Rosa would begin the long process of healing from a wound that went deeper than job loss, the devastating realization that 3 years of devotion could be erased by a single moment of false accusation. The afternoon silence in the mansion felt different from the peaceful quiet Rosa had known during her 3 years there. It pressed against the walls with an oppressive weight, no longer broken by the sound of her humming as she moved through rooms or the gentle efficiency of someone who understood that a home required more than cleaning. It needed tending, like a garden that thrived under loving care. Emily and Claire returned from school to find their father waiting for them in the front hallway, his expression carrying an uncomfortable formality that made Claire immediately suspicious and Emily instinctively fearful. At 8, Claire had developed the sharp intuition that comes from growing up in a household where emotions were often hidden beneath polite surfaces. She sensed catastrophe before Robert spoke a single word. "Girls, we need to talk," Robert began, using the tone he employed in business meetings when delivering news that wouldn't be well received. "Rosa won't be working for us anymore. She had to leave today for personal reasons." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, visible but incomprehensible to children who had never imagined that the most stable person in their lives could simply vanish. Emily, at 6, lacked the vocabulary to express the panic that flooded her chest, the terrible realization that the woman who kissed her goodnight every evening and sang away her nightmares was gone. "Where did Rosita go?" Emily whispered, her voice already thick with tears she didn't understand. "When is she coming back?" Claire demanded with 8-year-old authority, as if the force of her will could reverse whatever mistake had obviously been made. Robert felt the inadequacy of his explanation even as he delivered it, saw the confusion and fear in his daughter's faces, and for the first time began to question whether his decision had been as clear-cut as he had convinced himself. But pride and the momentum of accusation carried him forward, deeper into a lie that was easier than admitting he might have made a terrible mistake. "She's not coming back," he said with false gentleness. "Sometimes people have to make changes in their lives. You'll understand when you're older." But children understand more than adults give them credit for, and what Emily and Claire understood was abandonment, pure and simple. The person who had been their constant, their comfort, their guide through the mysteries of growing up had disappeared without warning, without goodbye, without even the courtesy of explanation. Their world, which had seemed as solid as the mansion's marble floors, revealed itself to be built on foundations that could shift without notice. That night, bedtime became a disaster. Emily refused to let Robert tuck her in, screaming for Rosita until her voice gave out and she collapsed into exhausted sobs. Claire maintained the kind of dignified silence that was somehow more heartbreaking than Emily's tears, allowing Robert to go through the motions of their bedtime routine while making it clear that his efforts were an inadequate substitute for what they had lost. "She didn't even say goodbye," Claire whispered in the darkness after Robert had finally left their rooms, addressing the emptiness where Rosa's presence had always been. "Rosita would never leave without saying goodbye." Children's logic, uncluttered by adult self-deception, cut straight to the heart of truth. Rosa, who had made Emily birthday cakes shaped like butterflies and had helped Claire practice soccer kicks until after dark, who had never missed a bedtime story or forgotten a scraped knee or failed to notice when either girl seemed sad, that Rosa would never have left without explanation or farewell. The mansion began to reveal its true nature in Rosa's absence. Without her invisible presence maintaining the warmth that made it feel like home, the house reverted to what it had always been beneath the surface, a showcase of wealth that impressed visitors but provided little comfort to the people who lived there. The marble floors echoed with loneliness, the crystal chandeliers cast beautiful but cold light, and the formal rooms that had been transformed by Rosa's love into spaces where children could play and dream returned to their museum-like sterility. Robert hired a new nanny within a week, a professionally trained woman with excellent references and a resume that would have impressed anyone who valued credentials over character. Karen Mitchell was efficient, punctual, and maintained exactly the kind of professional boundaries that Robert now convinced himself he should have insisted upon from the beginning. She followed schedules precisely, kept the children clean and fed and delivered to their activities on time, and never once made the mistake of loving them too much. But Emily and Claire recognized the difference immediately. Karen spoke to them politely but without warmth, managed their routines without intuition, and responded to their needs without understanding their hearts. She was everything Rosa wasn't, professional where Rosa had been personal, distant where Rosa had been devoted, adequate where Rosa had been extraordinary. "She doesn't love us," Emily confided to Claire one evening as they lay in their beds, staring at the ceiling where Rosa used to trace constellation patterns with a small flashlight, telling stories about brave princesses who lived among the stars. "Of course she doesn't," Claire replied with 8-year-old pragmatism. "She doesn't even know us." The truth of this observation settled over both girls like a blanket that provided no warmth. Karen knew their schedules, but not their dreams. Their dietary restrictions, but not their secret fears. Their academic requirements, but not the songs that made them feel safe. She was caring for their bodies while their spirits withered from emotional malnutrition. Days blended into weeks as the household adjusted to its new reality. Robert threw himself into work with even greater intensity, perhaps sensing that the home he returned to each evening had lost something essential, but unwilling to examine too closely what that might be. His cryptocurrency investments were performing exceptionally well. His net worth had increased by several $1,000,000 over the past quarter, and his latest business venture was attracting attention from investors across Silicon Valley. By any measurable standard, his life was succeeding brilliantly. Yet the mansion felt hollow in ways that no amount of money could address. Dinner conversations became stilted affairs, with Karen serving meals efficiently, but without the invisible seasoning of love that had made Rosa's cooking nourish more than just their bodies. The children ate mechanically, their usual chatter replaced by a politeness that broke Robert's heart, even as he refused to acknowledge its cause. Margaret Chen observed these changes with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved exactly what she intended. The house ran more smoothly now, she told herself, without the distraction of Rosa's inappropriate emotional attachment to the children. The boundaries between employer and employee were clearer, more professional, more suitable to a household of Robert's social standing. Her victory felt complete, even as its hollowness became increasingly apparent to everyone except herself. But truth has a persistent quality that makes it impossible to bury forever. Rosa's integrity had been beyond question for decades, and while Robert had been quick to believe the worst based on planted evidence and manufactured suspicions, other people who had known Rosa longer and better began to ask uncomfortable questions. Mrs. Patterson, a neighbor who had observed Rosa walking Emily and Claire to school for 3 years, mentioned to Robert how much she missed seeing that lovely Nanny who had always had such patience with the girls. Dr. Williams, the pediatrician who had treated Emily during her fever, asked Robert to pass along his gratitude to Rosa for her exceptional care during the crisis, noting that he rarely saw such devoted attention from hired caregivers. These casual comments planted seeds of doubt in Robert's mind, tiny cracks in his certainty that widened each time he watched his daughters struggle with their loss. Emily had developed nightmares that Karen couldn't soothe, waking several times each night calling for Rosita with a desperation that no amount of professional training could address. Claire had grown withdrawn and silent, performing her daily activities with mechanical compliance, but showing none of the spark and curiosity that had previously defined her personality. The breaking point came during Emily's 7th birthday party, an elaborate affair that Robert's assistant had coordinated with the same precision used for corporate events. The mansion's garden was transformed into a fairy tale wonderland with professional entertainment, gourmet catering, and decorations that would have impressed the most sophisticated adults. Emily's classmates attended in their party dresses, parents dropped off expensive gifts, and everything proceeded exactly as planned. But Emily stood in the middle of her own celebration, looking lost and hollow, searching faces for the one person who wasn't there. The woman who would have known exactly which fairy tale theme would make her eyes light up, who would have baked a cake shaped like butterflies and remembered to include the special candles that sang when lit. Rose's absence was more noticeable than any of the expensive decorations, more meaningful than all the professionally coordinated activities. "I want Rosita," Emily whispered to her father during a quiet moment, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched other children enjoy a party that felt like it belonged to someone else. "Why won't you bring Rosita back?" Robert knelt beside his daughter, seeing his own failure reflected in her disappointment, and for the first time since Rose's dismissal, allowed himself to truly consider whether he had made a mistake. The evidence that had seemed so convincing when presented by Margaret suddenly appeared flimsy and suspicious when weighed against 3 years of Rose's devoted service, her obvious love for the children, her integrity in countless small matters that no one else had bothered to notice. That night, after the party guests had gone home and the caterers had cleaned up the debris of celebration, Robert sat in his home office surrounded by the financial reports and investment portfolios that had consumed his attention while his daughters' hearts were breaking. His net worth had never been higher, his business ventures had never been more successful, his future had never looked more secure from a monetary perspective. But money, he was beginning to realize, couldn't restore the warmth that had left his home when Rosa walked down the front steps carrying her suitcase and his false accusation. No amount of wealth could replace the irreplaceable, the patience, intuition, and love that Rosa had brought to his family, the invisible threads of affection that had held their household together in ways he had never bothered to understand. For the first time in months, Robert allowed himself to remember Rosa not as the thief he had convinced himself she was, but as the woman who had sung his daughters to sleep, who had rushed to Emily's bedside during her illness, who had transformed their cold mansion into something resembling a home through the simple act of loving his children as if they were her own. The weight of possible injustice settled on his shoulders like a burden he could no longer ignore. If he had been wrong, and the growing evidence suggested he had been terribly, catastrophically wrong, then he had destroyed not just Rosa's life, but his daughter's happiness, had torn apart something precious for the sake of protecting wealth that had never truly been threatened. Outside the mansion's windows, San Francisco's fog rolled in from the Pacific, shrouding the city in gray mist that matched Robert's growing uncertainty. Somewhere in that fog, Rosa was living with the consequences of his accusation, carrying the wound of false charges and dismissal without dignity. His daughters were upstairs, grieving a loss they couldn't understand, missing the woman who had been their anchor in a world that suddenly felt unstable and cold. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, demanding a reckoning that would force Robert to confront not just his mistake, but the cruelty of assumptions based on prejudice rather than evidence. Margaret's deception was beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions, and soon the careful lies that had destroyed Rosa's reputation would crumble, exposing the ugly reality of envy and manipulation that had torn a family apart. But for now, in the quiet hours after Emily's ruined birthday party, Robert sat with his financial success and emotional failure, finally beginning to understand that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in dollars and cents, couldn't be protected by suspicion and distance, couldn't be replaced once they were lost through pride and prejudice. The awakening began with something as simple as a grocery receipt. Robert, who had never paid attention to such mundane details of household management, found himself examining the monthly expenses with the kind of scrutiny he usually reserved for investment portfolios. What he discovered made his stomach clench with the first stirring of genuine doubt about the accusations that had seemed so convincing just weeks earlier. The numbers told a story of meticulous honesty that contradicted everything Margaret Chen had implied about Rosa's financial behavior. Every purchase was accounted for, every dollar justified by receipts filed with obsessive precision. Rosa had been spending less than the budgeted amount for groceries, consistently finding ways to stretch the household funds while ensuring the children had everything they wanted. She had even kept detailed notes about the girls' preferences, tracking which brands of cereal Emily preferred and which snacks Claire would actually eat. More troubling still were the small personal expenses that Rosa had paid for herself. Birthday gifts for the children purchased with her own limited income, special treats that weren't part of the household budget, educational materials she thought would help with their homework. These receipts, meticulously organized in Rosa's careful handwriting, painted a picture of someone who gave more than she received, who spent her own money to enhance the lives of children who weren't even hers. Robert stared at these documents in his home office, the same space where he'd counted cryptocurrency gains and celebrated stock market victories, while remaining oblivious to the quiet integrity of the woman raising his daughters. The evidence of Rosa's honesty was overwhelming, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that Margaret's concerns had been motivated by something other than loyalty to his household. The revelation that shattered his remaining certainty came from an unexpected source, the mansion's security system that he had installed to protect his valuable art collection and expensive electronics, but had never thought to check for answers about smaller mysteries. The cameras that monitored the kitchen and main living areas had been recording everything, creating a digital archive of daily life that Robert had ignored in favor of more pressing business concerns. On a Saturday morning when Emily and Claire were at a playdate and Karen was running weekend errands, Robert finally accessed the security footage from the day Margaret claimed to have found money in Rosa's purse. What he saw on the screen made him physically ill with recognition of his own terrible mistake. The timestamp showed Margaret entering the kitchen while Rosa was upstairs with Claire, moving purposefully toward the counter where Robert left the weekly household cash. The video showed her taking the $100 bill, then approaching Rosa's purse with calculated deliberation, slipping the money inside with the careful precision of someone executing a plan rather than discovering a crime. Robert watched his own employee frame the woman who had loved his children, saw Margaret's face as she planted evidence that would destroy Rosa's reputation and shatter his daughter's sense of security. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Not just Margaret's betrayal of Rosa, but his own betrayal of someone who had deserved his trust and protection. The weight of injustice crushed down on Robert's shoulders as he sat before the computer screen, watching the digital proof of his catastrophic error in judgment. He had believed the worst about Rosa based on nothing more than class prejudice and suspicion, had destroyed 3 years of devoted service, because he found it easier to doubt her integrity than to challenge his own assumptions about people who worked for wages rather than owned stock portfolios. The children's reaction to Rosa's absence suddenly made perfect sense. They hadn't been adjusting to a necessary change. They had been grieving the loss of the person who loved them most, mourning the disappearance of their emotional anchor in a world that had suddenly become unstable and cold. Emily's nightmares and Claire's withdrawal weren't signs of childish difficulty with change. They were symptoms of genuine heartbreak, the natural response to losing someone who had been their true parent in every way that mattered. That afternoon, Robert confronted Margaret Chen with the video evidence, watching her face crumble as her lies were exposed. Her motivations poured out in a torrent of resentment and justification, jealousy of Rosa's relationship with the children, frustration with her own financial struggles, anger at being overlooked while Rosa received what seemed like endless love and appreciation. She got too comfortable, Margaret said defensively, as if her crime could be justified by Rosa's success at loving and being loved. These people need to remember their place. She was acting like family instead of help. The phrase, "these people," confirmed Robert's worst fears about his own complicity in Rosa's destruction. He had fired a woman of unquestionable integrity based on the poisonous prejudices of someone whose envy had twisted into deliberate cruelty. Margaret's words revealed the ugly truth about class and race that existed even in liberal San Francisco, even in households that prided themselves on progressive values and charitable giving. Robert terminated Margaret's employment immediately, but the damage couldn't be undone with swift justice. Rosa was gone, her reputation destroyed, her heart broken by the cruelty of false accusations. More importantly, his daughters were living with the grief of loss that could have been prevented if he had been less quick to judge and more willing to trust the evidence of his own eyes. The mansion felt like a morgue that evening as Robert struggled to find words to explain to Emily and Claire that Rosa had been innocent, that their intuition about her character had been correct, while his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. How do you tell children that the adult who was supposed to protect them had instead destroyed the person they loved most? How do you admit that prejudice and suspicion had triumphed over 3 years of witness devotion? "I made a terrible mistake," Robert finally told his daughters, kneeling in the living room where Rosa had once built blanket forts and told stories that made their imaginations soar. "Rosa didn't do anything wrong. She never took any money. I was wrong to let her go." Emily's face lit up with the kind of hope that only children can maintain in the face of adult failures. "Can we bring her back now? Can Rosita come home?" The word home cut through Robert's chest like a blade, reminding him that this mansion had only been a home when Rosa's love had made it one. Without her presence, they lived in a beautiful, expensive shell that provided shelter, but no warmth, protection, but no comfort, luxury, but no love. "I'm going to try to find her," Robert promised, though he had no idea where Rosa had gone after leaving their neighborhood, no way to reach someone who had disappeared into the anonymity of a city where domestic workers were as invisible as their labor was essential. The search for Rosa became Robert's mission, with the same intensity he had once devoted to building his fortune. He hired private investigators, contacted domestic placement agencies, drove through neighborhoods where he imagined someone with Rosa's limited resources might be able to afford rent. The investigation revealed just how little he had known about the woman who had shaped his daughters' lives, her immigration story, her family in Los Angeles, the daughter she had lost, and the grief that had driven her to pour all her maternal love into Emily and Claire. Finding Rosa required Robert to enter a world he had never bothered to notice, despite living adjacent to it for years. The Castro District apartment where Rosa had moved after her dismissal was in a building that housed other domestic workers, nannies and housekeepers and elder care providers who formed their own community of support and shared experience. These women had stories similar to Rosa's, tales of loving other people's children while their own families lived far away, of giving emotional labor that was never acknowledged, of being dismissed when convenient and forgotten when their employers moved on to new concerns. Rosa's neighbors were initially suspicious of Robert, recognizing in his expensive clothes and confident manner the type of employer who usually brought nothing but trouble to their lives. But desperation and genuine remorse broke through their protective barriers, and eventually he learned that Rosa was working as a companion for an elderly woman in the Mission District, her reputation somehow intact despite the cloud of accusation that had followed her from Pacific Heights. The reunion, when it finally came, took place not in the mansion's marble foyer, but in the modest living room of Mrs. Santos, a 90-year-old widow who had hired Rosa to provide the kind of patient, loving care that Rosa gave to everyone who needed her. Robert found Rosa reading aloud from a Spanish novel, her voice carrying the same gentle cadence he remembered from bedtime stories, her presence transforming another space through the simple act of bringing love to someone who had been alone. Rosa looked up from her reading to see Robert standing in the doorway, and her face showed the complex emotions of someone confronting a past that had brought both joy and pain. She was thinner than he remembered, her hair more silver, her eyes carrying new lines that spoke of sleepless nights and wounded dignity. But her voice, when she spoke, was steady and gracious. "Mr. Carmichael," she said quietly, rising from her chair with the natural courtesy that had never abandoned her, despite the cruelty she had suffered. The apology Robert had planned somehow seemed inadequate when faced with Rosa's calm presence, her refusal to show bitterness or anger, even though both would have been justified. Instead, he found himself speaking from the heart, without the polished phrases he had rehearsed during sleepless nights of preparation for this moment. I was wrong, Rosa. Completely, terribly wrong. Margaret planted that money in your purse. I have video proof. I fired an innocent woman and broke my daughter's hearts because I was too quick to believe the worst instead of trusting what I should have seen all along. Rosa listened without interruption, her dark eyes studying his face with the kind of attention she had always given to important matters. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, not because she needed time to forgive him, but because she needed time to understand how much damage his mistake had caused to everyone involved. The girls, she said finally, and her voice carried 3 months of worry about Emily and Claire, the children who had been torn from her without explanation or goodbye. How are my girls? The possessive pronoun was unconscious but revealing. Even after everything, Rosa thought of Emily and Claire as her girls, the children she had raised and loved and worried about during every day of their separation. Her first concern wasn't for her own vindication, but for the welfare of the children who had been the center of her world. Robert's answer came through tears he hadn't expected to shed, emotions that months of guilt and recognition had built up in his chest like pressure in a bottle finally allowed to release. They're heartbroken, Rosa. They miss you every day. Emily still has nightmares, and Claire has barely spoken since you left. They knew you would never have left them willingly. Children understand love better than adults, Rosa thought, remembering Emily and Claire's faces on her last morning in the mansion, the confusion and fear in their eyes when they said goodbye, not knowing it would be forever. They had recognized betrayal when their father couldn't, had trusted their hearts when his suspicions had overwhelmed his judgment. I never wanted to leave them, Rosa whispered, allowing herself for the first time in months to voice the grief that had been eating away at her heart. They were my life, Mr. Carmichael. After Isabella died, they became everything to me. The conversation that followed was quiet and honest, 2 adults finally speaking without the barriers of employment and social hierarchy that had prevented real communication for 3 years. Robert learned about Rosa's life before the mansion, the childhood in poverty that had taught her the value of every dollar, the daughter whose death had nearly destroyed her, the slow healing that came from pouring maternal love into other people's children. Rosa learned about Robert's own struggles with single parenthood, his fear that money couldn't solve the emotional problems his daughters faced, his growing recognition that the domestic help he had taken for granted had been providing something far more valuable than cleaning and child care. Mrs. Santos, who had been listening from her kitchen while pretending to prepare tea, eventually joined them in the living room. At 90, she had seen enough of life to recognize the rare moment when wrong could be made right, when pride could be swallowed in service of love. This woman has been a blessing to me, the elderly woman told Robert, her English accented by 9 decades of speaking Spanish at home. She talks to my daughter in Los Angeles every week to make sure I'm taking my medicine. She reads to me when my eyes are tired. She makes my loneliness feel less heavy. If you hurt her again, you'll answer to me. The fierce protection in Mrs. Santos's voice reminded Robert that Rosa didn't just bring love to rich families who could afford to hire her. Love was who she was, not just what she did for money. She made everyone around her feel more valued, more cared for, more human. Losing her from his family meant losing something that couldn't be replaced by professional competence or efficient service. I want to make this right, Robert said, addressing both women with the humility of someone who finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. Rosa, I want you to come home. The girls need you. I need you. The house isn't the same without you. But Rosa couldn't simply return to a situation where trust had been so completely shattered, where 3 years of devoted service had been erased by a single moment of suspicion. Too much had changed. Too much damage had been done. The innocence of their previous relationship couldn't be restored through apology alone. I can't just go back, Mr. Carmichael, Rosa said gently, her words carrying sadness but also strength. Not after what happened. Not after being accused of something so terrible. I need time to think, to decide what's best for everyone. Robert nodded, understanding that Rosa's caution was both justified and necessary. He had broken something precious through his prejudice and haste, and healing would require more than recognition of his mistake. It would require rebuilding trust, demonstrating through actions rather than words that Rosa's value was finally understood and appreciated. The mansion waited empty and cold, its marble floors echoing with the absence of the woman who had made it a home. Emily and Claire waited too, their hearts holding space for Rosa's return, while their minds struggled to understand why love had to be so complicated, why adults made mistakes that hurt the people who deserved protection most. The conversation in Mrs. Santos's living room was just the beginning of a longer process of repair and redemption. Robert would have to prove that his recognition of Rosa's worth extended beyond regret over his mistake, that he understood the difference between hiring help and welcoming family. Rosa would have to decide whether the love she still felt for Emily and Claire was strong enough to overcome the wound of false accusation, whether the home that had nurtured her heart could also break it and still be trusted again. But for the first time in months, hope lived alongside the pain. Possibility existed within the heartbreak, and the chance for healing stretched before them like sunlight breaking through San Francisco's perpetual fog. The letter arrived on Rosa's doorstep 3 days after Robert's visit, carried not by a postal worker, but by Emily and Claire themselves, their small hands trembling as they knocked on the apartment door in the Mission District. Robert waited in his car at the curb, understanding that this reunion needed to happen between Rosa and the children who had never stopped loving her, without adult interference or complicated explanations. When Rosa opened the door to find Emily and Claire standing in the narrow hallway, their faces bright with hope and desperate with longing, the careful composure she had maintained during Robert's apology finally crumbled. These were her girls, taller now after 3 months of separation, but still the same children who had run to her with scraped knees and bad dreams, who had trusted her with their secrets and fears and the small daily victories that made growing up an adventure. "Rosita!" Emily cried, launching herself into Rosa's arms with the complete faith of a 7-year-old who had never doubted that love would eventually triumph over confusion. Claire, more cautious at 9 but no less needy, hung back for a moment before allowing herself to believe that this reunion was real, that the person who had been the center of their world for 3 years was truly standing before them. When Rosa held out her other arm, Claire joined the embrace with tears streaming down her face, months of controlled emotion finally finding release in the safety of the woman who had taught her that love doesn't abandon even when circumstances force separation. "I missed you so much," Claire whispered against Rosa's shoulder, her voice muffled by fabric but clear in its desperate honesty. "I knew you didn't steal anything. I knew you'd never leave us if you had a choice." Rosa held them both, these children who had understood her character better than their father had, whose hearts had been wiser than adult suspicions and professional boundaries. In her small apartment that smelled of Mrs. Santos's cooking and her own homesick memories, surrounded by the simple furniture and treasured photographs that represented her real life, Rosa felt the first stirring of possibility that maybe, somehow, broken trust could be mended. The letter they brought was written in Emily's careful 7-year-old printing, with spelling corrections in Claire's neater hand, and it contained the kind of truth that children express without filters or self-consciousness. "Dear Rosita, we know Daddy made a mistake. We know you would never steal money because you always tell us that taking things that don't belong to us is wrong. We tried to tell him, but he wouldn't listen. Karen doesn't know how to make butterfly pancakes or sing the song about the little star. She doesn't remember that I don't like crusts on my sandwich or that Claire needs her stuffed elephant when she has nightmares. We need you to come home because you're our real mama, even if Daddy doesn't understand that yet. We love you more than all the money in the world. Please don't stay mad at us forever. Love, Emily and Claire." Rosa read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of heartbreak and hope. The children had tried to defend her, had recognized the truth when their father couldn't, had maintained their love despite months of separation and confusion. Their words carried the weight of absolute trust, the kind of faith that Rosa had spent 3 years earning through midnight fevers and patient homework help and countless small acts of devotion. "I could never be mad at you," Rosa whispered, pulling both girls close again. "You are my heart, both of you. You always have been." The afternoon stretched before them with the lazy comfort of reunion, and Rosa found herself falling back into patterns that felt as natural as breathing. She made hot chocolate the way the girls remembered, with extra marshmallows and a sprinkle of cinnamon. She listened to 3 months' worth of stories about school and friends and the ways their world had changed without her steady presence. She braided Claire's hair with the careful attention that had always made the 9-year-old feel special, and she helped Emily with homework that had been challenging without Rosa's patient explanations. But beneath the joy of reunion lay practical questions that couldn't be answered by love alone. Rosa's life had moved forward during their separation. She had made commitments to Mrs. Santos, had found purpose in caring for the elderly woman who needed her in different ways than Emily and Claire did. She had built new routines, new relationships, a new sense of identity that didn't depend on being needed by people who could dismiss her at will. "Can you come home now?" Emily asked with the directness of childhood, seemingly unaware of the complexity that surrounded such a simple question. Rosa looked at these children who would always be her babies, no matter how much they grew or how complicated their lives became, and felt the familiar pull of maternal love fighting against hard-earned wisdom about protecting her own heart. "It's not that simple, mi amor," she said gently, using the endearment that had always felt natural despite professional boundaries. "Adults sometimes need time to fix things that get broken. But children live in the present moment, and for Emily and Claire, the present moment contained Rosa's presence, her love, her attention to details that made them feel valued and understood. The future was less important than the chocolate mustaches she wiped away with the same tenderness she had always shown, the way she remembered that Claire preferred her hot chocolate without whipped cream, and Emily wanted extra. When Robert finally knocked on the apartment door, he found his daughters transformed back into the happy children they had been before Rosa's dismissal. Their laughter filled the small apartment, their chatter sparkled with the animation that had been missing for months, and their faces glowed with the security that comes from being with someone who sees you clearly and loves you completely. "They look like themselves again," Robert said quietly to Rosa while the girls played with a puzzle on the living room floor. Their heads bent together in the kind of comfortable collaboration that Rosa had fostered through years of patient guidance. "Children need constancy," Rosa replied, her words carrying gentle instruction along with observation. "They need to know that the people they love won't disappear without explanation." It was the closest Rosa would come to reproach, this simple statement of child development that highlighted the damage caused by Robert's hasty decision. She wasn't angry, Rosa realized as she spoke. Anger required energy she couldn't spare, and besides, anger wouldn't heal the wounds that needed healing. Understanding would, forgiveness would, the kind of love that sees beyond mistakes to the possibility of redemption. The conversation that followed was different from their previous meeting, less formal, more honest, shaped by the presence of children who had no patience for adult complications when their happiness hung in the balance. Robert found himself explaining not just his mistake, but his fear, the insecurity that had made him quick to doubt Rosa's integrity when faced with the possibility that someone might take advantage of his wealth. "I've never trusted easily," he admitted, watching Emily show Rosa a drawing she had made during the months of separation, a picture of their family that included Rosa standing between the two girls, all 3 figures holding hands. "My business success came from being suspicious, from assuming the worst and protecting myself accordingly. I treated you like a potential threat instead of recognizing what you actually were." "And what was that?" Rosa asked, genuinely curious about how he now understood her role in his family. Robert looked at his daughters, saw how they gravitated toward Rose's presence like plants turning toward sunlight, noticed how their entire demeanor had changed in the space of an afternoon, simply because they were with the person who loved them most. "The heart of our family," he said simply, "the person who made our house a home." It was the recognition Rosa had waited 3 years to hear, the acknowledgement that her contributions extended far beyond childcare and household management into the realm of emotional nurturing that money couldn't purchase. But recognition alone couldn't erase the damage of dismissal, couldn't restore the innocent trust that had been shattered by false accusations and professional distance. "I want to come home," Rosa admitted, her voice carrying years of longing and months of heartbreak. "But I need to know that this won't happen again. I need to know that my place in your family is secure, that my love for the girls won't be seen as a threat to your authority." Robert nodded, understanding that Rosa was asking for more than her job back. She was asking for respect, for recognition, for the kind of security that would allow her to love Emily and Claire without fear that her devotion would be used against her when convenient. "What would you need?" he asked. "What would make you feel safe coming back?" Rosa had thought about this question during the sleepless nights that followed their first conversation, had imagined what return might look like if it were possible at all. Her answer surprised Robert with its simplicity. "I need to be family," she said quietly. "Not an employee who can be dismissed without cause, not help who can be replaced when convenient. If I come back, it has to be as someone who belongs there, someone whose presence is valued for more than just services rendered." Family. The word hung in the apartment's warm air, radical in its implications for a household that had always maintained strict boundaries between employers and staff. But Robert looked at his daughters, saw how they had bloomed in Rosa's presence after months of withering in her absence, and understood that love couldn't be contained by job descriptions or service contracts. "You've always been family," Emily piped up from the floor where she was showing Rosa her latest homework assignment. "You're our mama in our hearts." Children, Robert realized, had understood something that had escaped him entirely. Rosa hadn't been trying to overstep boundaries or exceed her role. She had been responding to Emily and Claire's need for maternal love with her own need to mother, creating a relationship that transcended employment because it was born from genuine feeling rather than professional obligation. The solution, when it finally emerged from their careful negotiation, was both simple and revolutionary. Rosa would return not as a nanny but as a member of the family, with security and respect and the understanding that her love for Emily and Claire was an asset to be protected rather than a threat to be managed. Robert would have his lawyer draw up papers that guaranteed Rosa's place in their household, that made her dismissal impossible except under the most extreme circumstances, that recognized her contributions as essential rather than convenient. But more importantly, Robert would work to understand the difference between hiring help and welcoming family, between managing employees and nurturing relationships. He would learn to see Rosa's love for his daughters as the gift it had always been, would stop fearing that her maternal instincts somehow diminished his paternal authority. "Can you come home with us today?" Claire asked, with 9-year-old impatience for adult complications that delayed obvious solutions. Rosa looked around the small apartment that had sheltered her during months of heartbreak and healing, thought about Mrs. Santos, who would need new care arrangements, considered the practical details of uprooting a life she had carefully rebuilt from the ashes of accusation and dismissal. "Not today, mi amor," she said gently, pulling Claire close. "But soon. Very soon." The promise settled over all of them like a benediction, hope made tangible through careful words and shared understanding. Emily clapped her hands with delight, Claire smiled for the first time in months, and Robert felt something loosening in his chest, the knot of guilt and regret that had tightened around his heart since the moment he realized his terrible mistake. That evening, as Rosa tucked Emily and Claire into the pull-out sofa where they had begged to spend the night, she felt the familiar rhythm of love that made all the complications worthwhile. These children were her heart, had been her heart from the moment she first held them, would always be her heart no matter what legal documents or family arrangements defined their relationship. "Sweet dreams, my babies," she whispered in the darkness, words she had spoken hundreds of times in the mansion's expensive nursery, words that carried the same meaning in her modest apartment. Love didn't require luxury to be real, didn't need formal recognition to be true. The mansion waited for her return, its marble floors ready to echo once again with Rosa's humming, its rooms prepared to fill with the warmth that only love could bring. But more importantly, Emily and Claire waited, their hearts finally able to hope that constancy was possible, that the person who loved them most would never disappear again. Tomorrow would bring practical considerations and transition plans, conversations about Mrs. Santos's care and Rosa's belongings, the careful orchestration of return that would heal the wounds of separation. But tonight was for reunion, for the simple pleasure of being together again, for the restoration of bonds that 3 months of separation had tested, but never truly broken. In the morning, San Francisco's fog would lift as it always did, revealing the city's beauty to those who had the patience to wait for clarity. And in Rosa's heart, the fog of hurt and uncertainty was already lifting, burned away by the warmth of love that had survived betrayal, endured separation, and emerged stronger than the forces that had tried to destroy it. The restoration began not with grand gestures, but with small changes that acknowledged how completely Robert's understanding of family had been transformed. When Rosa officially returned to the Carmichael mansion 2 weeks later, she found her belongings moved from the third-floor servants' room to a beautiful suite on the second floor, adjacent to the girls' bedrooms and decorated with the same care and attention that had been given to the family's private spaces. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Rosa was no longer banished to the servants' quarters, no longer relegated to the margins of a household she had helped create. Her new room had windows that overlooked the garden where she had taught Emily to plant flowers and had helped Claire practice soccer kicks until after dark. It had space for her photographs of Isabella, for the books she loved to read during rare quiet moments, for the personal possessions that transformed a room from mere accommodation into a true home. "Do you like it, Rosita?" Emily asked anxiously, bouncing on the new bed that had been chosen for comfort rather than cost-effectiveness, her 7-year-old face serious with concern that this homecoming be perfect. Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she looked around the room that represented more than upgraded housing. It was Robert's tangible acknowledgement that she belonged here, that her presence was valued, that the love she brought to this family deserved respect and security. "It's beautiful, mi amor," Rosa whispered, pulling Emily close. "More beautiful than I ever imagined." Claire, hovering in the doorway with the careful observation skills she had developed over 9 years of reading adults' emotional weather, relaxed when she saw Rosa's genuine pleasure. The past 3 months had taught Claire that grown-ups could make mistakes that shattered children's worlds, but maybe they could also fix those mistakes with enough effort and love. The changes extended beyond Rosa's living arrangements to every aspect of how the household operated. Robert met with Rosa weekly now, not to issue instructions or check on performance, but to discuss Emily and Claire's needs, to plan family activities, to ensure that the woman who knew his daughters best had input into decisions that affected their lives. These conversations revealed to Robert just how much he had missed during years of emotional distance. Claire's struggle with math anxiety, Emily's budding interest in marine biology, the complex social dynamics of 2nd and 4th grade that required delicate navigation. "Emily's been asking about dolphins," Rosa mentioned during one of their evening talks, her voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone reporting on beloved family members. "I think she'd love a trip to the aquarium, maybe with some books about ocean life." These suggestions, which would have been seen as overstepping boundaries in the old arrangement, were now welcomed as valuable insight from someone who paid attention to the children's growing interests and changing needs. Robert found himself seeing Emily and Claire through Rosa's eyes, not as small people to be managed and maintained, but as individuals with their own dreams and fears and curiosities that deserved nurturing. The transformation in the children was immediate and profound. Emily's nightmares disappeared within a week of Rose's return, her sleep peaceful once again under the protection of someone she trusted completely. Claire's withdrawn silence gave way to renewed chatter about friends and school and the soccer skills she was determined to perfect with Rose's patient coaching. Both girls seemed to grow taller in the warmth of restored love, their faces bright with the security that comes from knowing that the essential people in their lives wouldn't disappear without warning. "You saved them," Karen Mitchell, the professional nanny who had been their mediocre caretaker during Rose's absence, told Robert on her last day. She had watched the children transform back into happy, confident little girls in the week since Rose's return, had seen how completely inadequate her own professional competence was compared to Rose's intuitive understanding of what Emily and Claire needed. "I'm good at my job, but Rosa loves them. There's no comparison." Robert had learned enough about the difference between good and perfect to understand Karen's observation completely. Professional competence could manage children's basic needs, but love created the environment where children could flourish, could develop confidence and kindness, and the secure attachment that would shape their relationships for the rest of their lives. The mansion itself seemed to exhale with relief at Rose's return, its rooms filling once again with the sounds of genuine happiness, laughter from the kitchen during afternoon baking sessions, gentle singing from the girls' bedrooms during the evening routine, the comfortable murmur of conversation during family meals that felt like celebrations rather than obligations. Rose's presence restored the warmth that money couldn't buy, but love could create effortlessly. Margaret Chen's betrayal had left scars that needed healing, but Robert addressed those wounds with the same thoroughness he brought to complex business deals. He wrote letters of recommendation for Rosa that explicitly refuted any suggestion of dishonesty, ensuring that her reputation was restored among the network of wealthy families who employed domestic workers. He made financial amends through a generous bonus that acknowledged both the injustice of her dismissal and the value of her devoted service. Most importantly, he told the truth about what had happened, taking responsibility for his mistake and Margaret's deception in conversations with neighbors and friends who had wondered about Rose's sudden disappearance. "I let prejudice and suspicion override 3 years of witnessed integrity," Robert admitted to Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had mentioned missing Rose's cheerful presence. "The best thing that ever happened to my family, and I almost destroyed it through ignorance and fear." These public acknowledgments of his error served multiple purposes. They cleared Rose's name. They demonstrated Robert's commitment to ensuring such injustice never happened again. And they forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth about his own biases and assumptions. The wealthy man who had built an empire through careful calculation had been revealed as someone who could be manipulated by prejudice, whose judgment could be clouded by the very cynicism that had protected his business interests. But the most meaningful changes were the smallest ones. The way Robert now asked Rose's opinion about family decisions, the way he included her in conversations about the girl's future, the way he had learned to see her love for Emily and Claire as a strength rather than a threat. When the children's school called about Claire's excellent science project, Rosa was the first person Robert contacted to share the good news. When Emily needed encouragement before a piano recital, Rosa's reassurance was sought alongside parental support. "She's family now," Robert explained to his business partner, who had expressed confusion about the unusual arrangement. "Not an employee, not a helper, family. The legal documents make it official. But the love made it true years ago." The legal documents Robert referenced were groundbreaking in their own way, contracts that guaranteed Rose's place in the household for as long as she wanted it, that provided for her retirement and health care, that recognized her contributions with compensation that reflected her actual value rather than market rates for domestic work. These papers represented security that Rosa had never expected to have, financial protection that allowed her to love Emily and Claire without fear that devotion could be used against her when convenient. More importantly, Robert had established a foundation in Rosa's name, dedicated to supporting domestic workers who provided loving care to families across San Francisco. The Rosa Martinez Family Care Foundation offered education scholarships, legal assistance for workers facing false accusations, and advocacy for better treatment of the women who raised other people's children with their own hearts. It was Robert's way of ensuring that other families wouldn't make his mistakes, that other Rosa Martinezes wouldn't suffer for loving too much or being trusted too little. "You didn't need to do this," Rosa told him when the foundation was announced, her voice thick with emotion at seeing her name associated with hope rather than accusation. "Yes, I did," Robert replied firmly. "I needed to honor what you represent, the women who hold families together, who love other people's children as their own, who deserve respect and security and recognition for their irreplaceable contributions." The foundation's first scholarship recipient was a young woman named Carmen, who worked as a nanny while studying to become a teacher. At the award ceremony, held in the mansion's garden where Rosa had once felt invisible and unvalued, Carmen spoke about the domestic workers who had raised her while her own mother cleaned houses across the city. "They love us when our parents can't be there," Carmen said, her words carrying across an audience that included wealthy families and domestic workers alike. "They deserve to be seen as the angels they are, not invisible helpers whose hearts don't matter." Rosa sat in the front row during Carmen's speech, Emily and Claire on either side of her, their hands clasped together in the kind of casual affection that had been restored along with everything else. She wore a dress Robert had insisted on buying for the occasion, not because her own clothes weren't good enough, but because he wanted her to feel honored on a day dedicated to celebrating her worth. The foundation's work was already expanding beyond San Francisco, attracting attention from other cities where domestic workers needed advocacy and support. Rosa found herself becoming an unexpected spokesperson, sharing her story at conferences and community meetings, helping other families understand the difference between hiring help and welcoming heart. "Love doesn't follow employment law," she would tell audiences who listened with growing recognition of truths they had never considered. "When we love children, we become family. When families don't see us as family, everyone gets hurt." These speaking engagements had transformed Rosa from a private person who preferred invisibility into a public advocate for invisible women everywhere. Her dignity in the face of injustice had become an example for others who faced similar challenges. Her resilience, a source of strength for domestic workers who wondered if their devotion would ever be recognized or respected. But the most profound changes were happening at home, in the daily rhythms of family life that now openly acknowledged Rosa as its center. Sunday mornings found her making pancakes shaped like butterflies, while Emily and Claire helped measure ingredients, and Robert read the newspaper at the kitchen island, all of them comfortable in the kind of easy intimacy that had taken years to develop and months of separation to fully value. "I have a confession," Robert said one such morning, looking up from financial reports that showed his continued prosperity in markets that rewarded his business acumen. "I used to think money solved everything. I thought if I provided enough wealth, the children would have everything they needed." Rosa looked at him with gentle understanding, recognizing the admission of a man who had learned the difference between provision and presence, between financial security and emotional safety. "Money is important," she said carefully, not wanting to diminish his efforts to provide for his daughter's futures. "But love is what makes a life worth living." Emily and Claire, covered in flour and giggling at their own culinary creativity, were living proof of Rosa's philosophy. They were growing up surrounded by luxury that many children could only dream of: private schools and expensive vacations, designer clothes and elaborate birthday parties. But what made them truly happy was Rosa's patient attention to their homework, her enthusiastic audience for their talent shows, her steady presence during both the crises and celebrations that marked their journey toward adulthood. "I want to adopt her," Emily announced with 7-year-old directness, looking from her father to Rosa with the kind of logical certainty that made adult complications seem ridiculous. "If Rosita is our family, then she should be our family for real." The suggestion hung in the kitchen's warm air, radical in its simplicity, challenging in its implications for legal structures that weren't designed to accommodate the kind of chosen family that had evolved in the Carmichael household. But Robert, who had learned to value his daughter's emotional intelligence, found himself seriously considering how such an arrangement might work. "What do you think, Rosa?" he asked, recognizing that the decision belonged to the woman who had been mothering his children for years without legal recognition or protection. Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Emily and Claire, these girls who had been her babies in every way that mattered, whose love had healed the wound left by Isabella's death and created something new and precious in her heart. "I think," Rosa said softly, her voice carrying years of longing and months of hard-won wisdom, "that love makes family. Not paperwork, but paperwork helps protect love." The legal adoption wouldn't happen quickly. Such arrangements required careful navigation of laws that weren't designed for their unique situation. But the intention was enough for now, the acknowledgement that Rosa's place in their family deserved the kind of permanence that no employment arrangement could provide. That evening, as Rosa tucked Emily and Claire into beds that were finally free of nightmares and anxiety, she reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by love's triumph over injustice. She was no longer the invisible woman who had arrived at the mansion with a broken heart and humble dreams. She was Rosa Martinez, beloved mother to Emily and Claire, respected member of the Carmichael family, advocate for domestic workers everywhere, living proof that love could overcome prejudice when hearts were willing to change. "Sweet dreams, my babies," she whispered in the darkness, words that carried all the weight of maternal love finally recognized and respected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, the ongoing work of building a family based on love rather than law, on choice rather than chance. But tonight was for gratitude, for the miracle of second chances, for the restoration of everything that mattered most. The past year had taught all of them that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased or protected through suspicion and distance. Love required trust, family demanded vulnerability, and healing needed the kind of courage that admitted mistakes and worked to make them right. In their beautiful mansion overlooking San Francisco Bay, surrounded by luxury that impressed visitors but love that transformed lives, the Carmichael family had finally become real, not through blood or marriage or legal documents, but through the everyday miracle of people choosing to love each other completely, imperfectly, forever. 5 years had passed since Rosa's return to the Carmichael family, and the mansion on Pacific Heights had become something it never was during its first decade of existence, a true home where love lived in every corner and laughter echoed through marble halls that had once felt cold and impersonal. The legal adoption had been completed 3 years earlier, making Rosa officially Emily and Claire's mother in the eyes of the law, though their hearts had recognized this truth long before any paperwork made it official. On a crisp October morning, Rosa stood in what had once been called the Help's Kitchen, but was now simply the heart of their home, preparing breakfast for a family that had grown in unexpected ways. Emily, now 12 and tall for her age, helped her navigate the contents of a refrigerator covered with drawings, report cards, soccer schedules, and the beautiful chaos that accumulates when children know they are truly valued. Claire, 14, and showing signs of the strong woman she was becoming, sat at the kitchen island reviewing French vocabulary, while unconsciously humming the same lullaby Rosa had once sung to chase away her nightmares. Robert descended the stairs at his usual time, but everything else about the morning routine had evolved to reflect how completely his understanding of family had been transformed. Instead of checking his phone for overnight market updates, he kissed Rosa's cheek and asked about her plans for the day, fully aware that her schedule, volunteer work with the foundation, lunch with Mrs. Santos, who had become like a grandmother to the girls, parent conferences at the school where she was now recognized as Emily and Claire's mother, was as important as his own business meetings. Carmen's scholarship interview is this afternoon, Rosa mentioned, referring to the foundation's latest applicant, a young woman who worked as a caregiver while studying nursing. I think she's perfect for the program. The Rosa Martinez Family Care Foundation had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations, providing scholarship assistance to over 200 domestic workers who were pursuing education while supporting families across the Bay Area. Rosa's involvement had evolved from grateful recipient of Robert's attempt to make amends into passionate advocate for women whose stories mirrored her own journey from invisibility to recognition. "Tell me about her," Robert said, settling into the comfortable conversation about work that now included Rosa's contributions as naturally as his own corporate responsibilities. As Rosa described Carmen's background, a single mother whose employer had initially objected to her college classes until realizing that education made her an even better caregiver, Robert felt the familiar pleasure of discovering how Rosa's wisdom extended beyond their immediate family into a wider world that benefited from her experience and insight. Their conversation was interrupted by Emily's delighted squeal from the living room, where she had been checking the mail before school. "Rosita, look what came!" Emily rushed into the kitchen carrying an official-looking envelope addressed to Mrs. Rosa Carmichael, a name that still made Rosa's heart flutter with joy even after 3 years of legal recognition. The return address indicated it was from the University of San Francisco, where Rosa had been quietly taking courses in early childhood development, pursuing the degree that would allow her to formalize her decades of intuitive expertise in caring for children. "Is it what I think it is?" Claire asked, abandoning her French vocabulary to join the family gathering around Rosa as she opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The acceptance letter was everything Rosa had hoped for, but never quite dared to expect. Admission to the university's graduate program in child development, with a full scholarship funded by an anonymous donor who believed in supporting non-traditional students with relevant life experience. What Rosa didn't know, and what Robert would never tell her, was that he had quietly established the scholarship program specifically to ensure her application would be accepted and funded. "I'm going to be a real student," Rosa whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she read the letter twice to make sure she wasn't imagining this impossible dream. At 52, she would be returning to formal education for the first time since high school, pursuing credentials that would validate what everyone who knew her already understood, that she possessed an extraordinary gift for nurturing children's emotional and intellectual development. "You're already real," Emily said with 12-year-old indignation at any suggestion that Rosa needed external validation to confirm her worth. "You're the realest person I know." Children's wisdom, Robert reflected as he watched his daughters celebrate Rosa's acceptance with unqualified joy, always cut straight to essential truth. Rosa had always been real in every way that mattered, real in her love, real in her devotion, real in her understanding of what children needed to flourish. The university degree would simply provide external recognition for gifts that had been nurturing young lives for decades. The celebration continued over breakfast, with Emily and Claire planning how they would help Rosa prepare for her graduate studies, their excitement reflecting the kind of support that flows naturally in families where everyone's dreams are valued equally. Robert found himself imagining Rosa in a few years, combining her natural gifts with academic credentials to help other families understand the profound impact that loving caregivers could have on children's development. "You could write a book," Claire suggested with the seriousness of a 14-year-old who had inherited her father's strategic thinking, "about how to really take care of children, not just manage them." The idea intrigued Rosa, as she considered how her journey from grieving mother to devoted nanny to family advocate might offer hope to other women who found themselves pouring maternal love into other people's children. Her story contained lessons about the difference between service and love, about the power of patient devotion, about the possibility of healing after heartbreak. "Maybe I will," Rosa said thoughtfully, already imagining chapters about the importance of seeing domestic workers as full human beings with their own dreams and needs, about the way love transforms houses into homes, about what happens when families choose to expand their definition of belonging beyond traditional boundaries. That afternoon, Rosa arrived at the foundation office in time to interview Carmen, the scholarship applicant, whose quiet dignity reminded Rosa of her former self. Carmen had been working as a nanny for a tech executive's family while taking nursing classes at night, her own daughter cared for by her mother in a cramped apartment that housed 3 generations of women supporting each other through love and determination. "I want to be a pediatric nurse," Carmen explained during their interview, her voice carrying the kind of quiet certainty that Rosa recognized in women who had found their calling through caring for children. "But I also want families like the one I work for to understand that their nannies have dreams too, that we're not just temporary help, but people with goals and hopes for our futures." Rosa nodded with complete understanding, seeing in Carmen's story the same struggles she had faced. The challenge of being viewed as hired help rather than skilled professional, the difficulty of pursuing personal goals while caring for other people's children, the loneliness of loving families who might never truly see you as more than an employee. "The scholarship comes with more than money," Rosa explained, describing the foundation's mentorship program, networking opportunities, and advocacy training that helped recipients become leaders in their communities. "We want to support your education and your voice, because women like us have wisdom that the world needs to hear." As Carmen left the interview with tears of gratitude in her eyes and a scholarship packet in her hands, Rosa reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by Robert's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and work to make them right. The foundation existed because of injustice, but its impact created justice for hundreds of women who might otherwise remain invisible despite their invaluable contributions to the families they served. The drive home took Rosa through neighborhoods she remembered from her darkest days after leaving the Carmichael employment, the Castro district where she had found refuge, the Mission where Mrs. Santos still lived in comfortable independence, the Richmond where other domestic workers she had met during her exile were now thriving in better circumstances. The city looked different when viewed from the perspective of someone who belonged somewhere, who had security and respect, and the kind of love that created roots rather than merely providing temporary shelter. The mansion appeared as Rosa turned onto their street, its elegant facade unchanged, but its emotional reality completely transformed. This was no longer Robert Carmichael's house where Rosa worked. It was the Carmichael family home where Rosa lived as wife to Robert in all but name, mother to Emily and Claire in every way that mattered, and matriarch of a household that operated on principles of mutual respect and shared love. Robert's car was already in the driveway, which meant he had left his downtown office early to spend more time with the family that had become the center of his world. The man who had once measured success purely in financial terms now calculated wealth in terms of laughter over dinner, bedtime conversations with his daughters, and quiet moments with Rosa when they planned their shared future. "How did the interview go?" he asked as Rosa entered through the kitchen door that had once marked her as help, but now welcomed her as someone coming home to her own space. "She reminds me of myself at that age," Rosa replied, settling into easy conversation about foundation business that had become as important to their household as Robert's corporate dealings. Determined, scared, hoping that hard work and love will be enough to build something better. They were discussing Carmen's application when Emily and Claire burst through the front door with the kind of energetic chatter that filled the house each afternoon, their voices carrying news of friends and classes and the small dramas that made teenage life feel monumentally important. Both girls had grown into confident, empathetic young women who navigated their privileged lives with awareness of their good fortune and appreciation for the people who had made their happiness possible. "Mom, can Carmen's daughter come for a sleepover this weekend?" Emily asked Rosa, using the title that had evolved naturally over the years, reflecting the reality of their relationship rather than legal technicalities. Rosa's heart still fluttered each time the girls called her Mom, each instance a small miracle that reminded her how completely her life had been restored and transformed. Carmen's daughter Maria was 8 years old, the same age Claire had been when Rosa first arrived at the mansion, and Emily had appointed herself as unofficial big sister to the scholarship recipients' children. "Of course, mi amor," Rosa replied, already planning how to make the weekend special for Maria, whose mother worked so hard to provide opportunities that hadn't existed in Carmen's own childhood. "We'll make butterfly pancakes and teach her to play soccer in the garden." These small kindnesses had become family traditions, ways of extending their happiness to include children whose parents were fighting the same battles Rosa had once faced. The mansion's guest rooms regularly hosted the sons and daughters of Foundation scholarship recipients, giving them glimpses of possibilities while ensuring they understood that love, not wealth, was what made families strong. Dinner that evening was a celebration of Rosa's university acceptance, with Emily and Claire presenting a homemade card decorated with photos from their years together. Pictures of birthday parties and school plays, soccer games and quiet homework sessions, the visual record of a family that had chosen each other through love rather than biology. Robert produced a bottle of champagne he had been saving for this moment, having known Rosa would be accepted to the graduate program, just as he had known she possessed the intelligence and dedication to excel in any academic setting. "To Rosa," Robert said, raising his glass in a toast that carried years of gratitude and respect. "The heart of our family, the soul of our home, the woman who taught us all that love is the only wealth that truly matters." As glasses clinked and laughter echoed through the dining room that had once felt formal and cold, Rosa reflected on the young woman she had been when she first walked through these doors carrying her single suitcase and broken heart. That Rosa had been invisible, replaceable, vulnerable to the whims of employers who saw her as hired help rather than skilled professional. She had loved in silence, served without recognition, and endured dismissal with dignity, because she possessed no power to demand better treatment. The woman she had become was visible, valued, secure in the knowledge that her place in this family was permanent and respected. She no longer loved in silence, but spoke with authority about children's needs and family dynamics. She served not from obligation, but from choice. Her contributions recognized and celebrated rather than taken for granted. Most importantly, she had found her voice as an advocate for other women who deserved the same recognition and respect. "I never imagined this life was possible," Rosa admitted to Robert later that evening, as they sat together in what had once been his private study, but now served as a family room where homework was completed and dreams were discussed. The walls were lined with photographs that told their story. Formal family portraits that included Rosa from the beginning, candid shots of daily life that captured genuine happiness, and Rosa's diploma from her foundation training program, framed with the same pride as Robert's business awards. "I never imagined family could feel like this," Robert replied, his voice carrying the wonder of someone who had discovered that the most valuable investments were emotional rather than financial. "You didn't just change our lives, Rosa. You saved them." Through the study's windows, San Francisco sparkled in the evening light, a city where two very different worlds, extreme wealth and working poverty, existed in close proximity without often intersecting. But in their household, those worlds had not just intersected, but merged into something new. A family based on love rather than law, on choice rather than circumstance, on the revolutionary idea that worth was measured in devotion rather than dollars. Emily and Claire could be heard upstairs, their voices drifting through the house as they completed homework assignments with the kind of confident engagement that came from knowing their efforts were supported and valued. They were growing up bilingual in English and Spanish, fluent in both privilege and humility, comfortable in the mansion's luxury, but equally at ease in Mrs. Santos's small apartment or the foundation office where they volunteered during school breaks. "They're going to change the world," Rosa said with the quiet certainty of someone who had watched these children develop empathy and strength under her guidance. "They already have," Robert replied, thinking of how Emily and Claire had changed his world, how Rosa had changed their world, how their family had become an example of what was possible when people chose to love beyond traditional boundaries. As the evening settled into comfortable routine, Rosa felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived, from love that had survived betrayal and emerged stronger, from dreams that had been deferred but not abandoned. At 52, she was beginning graduate school, expanding her advocacy work, and raising two daughters who would carry her values into the next generation. The lonely woman, who had once grieved for her lost daughter, had become the mother of a chosen family that extended far beyond the mansion's walls to include scholarship recipients, their children, and countless women who drew strength from her example. The fairy tale ending wasn't perfect. Real life never was. But it was true in all the ways that mattered. Love had triumphed over prejudice, family had expanded beyond biology, and a woman who had once been invisible had become the shining center of lives that were richer for her presence. In a world that often valued the wrong things, the Carmichael family had learned to treasure what actually mattered, the daily miracle of people who choose to love each other completely, imperfectly, permanently. And you, have you ever cared for someone who later forgot you? Have you ever been invisible despite your devotion? Have you ever loved like a mother but been treated like hired help? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this story moved your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another soul that needs to feel seen and valued. For more stories that honor the invisible angels who hold families together through love, check our podcast link on the left. Thank you for sharing this journey of the heart with us. Until we meet again in the next story that reminds us that love, not money, is the only wealth that truly transforms lives.